and welcome to the PhD Life Coach podcast. And I am joined by a guest again. And this time I'm joined by the author of a new book, which we're going to be talking about today. So, welcome, Dr. Maria Lamonaca Wisdom, who is the Assistant Vice Provost of Faculty Advancement at Duke University. So, welcome, Maria.
Thank you, Vicky. I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for this invitation.
We are excited, and I've got your book. Anybody watching on YouTube can see me flashing it at the camera. It is How to Mentor Anyone in Academia. So, why do you think we needed a book on how to mentor in academia? Why did that feel important right now?
Sure. Well, there's several reasons. One is that I think mentoring is always messy and complicated because mentoring involves two or more human beings interacting in a professional relationship, and human relationships are inherently messy. So that's one reason. A second reason is that the professional and academic landscape for those now in the mentee position in higher education is incredibly complicated. And it's far more complicated, say, than it was for me when I was a graduate student a few decades ago. And I think one of the problems we run into in mentoring is this ingrained assumption that, the mentor is modeling the professional trajectory for the mentee, and the mentee will follow in the mentor's footsteps. Oh, and by the way, the mentor has to give lots and lots of advice and know all the answers. That model isn't working so well right now. I mean, it hasn't for a while, and I think it's just getting worse. And so I think there's that second reason, this mismatch between what mentees need now and mentors feel like they should be giving. And I'll finally say the third reason I think why this book is hopefully necessary is that I don't need to explain to this audience how busy academic mentors are. I mean, they're stretched in a million ways. There's a million claims on their time. It only just seems to be getting worse as university resources contract and resources thin out. Mentors don't have time to, take a semester-long course in mentoring, or even, I mean, we sometimes have trouble getting faculty in the door for a 2-hour session on, thinking about their mentoring. So what is going to be the most time efficient, effective way to get them the information they need when they need it? There actually are a ton of resources on mentoring. Mentoring is a field of study that's existed for at least 30 years. And if you were to Google mentoring in a search engine, an enormous amount of stuff will pop up. Can you go to ChatGPT and get it to summarize best practices on mentoring? Yeah, but you're going to get just a lot of stuff and not curated. So ultimately, my hope was to create sort of a friendly, accessible guide that mentors could keep on their bookshelf. And not some ground path breaking new research on mentoring. There's plenty of that, and it's great. But I mean, my book really is meant to synthesize a lot of the best practices. And here are the things, I recommend that you pay attention to right now. I think it helps mentors think about mentoring in a way that's easy to grasp and understand. And it encourages mentors to think about coaching in new and different ways, and in ways that are fresh and interesting, and hopefully that will resonate with mentees. So that's the reason. Those are the three reasons I've written the book.
Perfect. And yeah, just to reiterate, my audience, as you know, is majority PhD students, but a lot of academics as well. And I see all the time my interactions with listeners and then my members, the issues around mentorship, whether that is your direct sort of advisor, mentorship from them, or whether it's the people around you. Issues around mentorship are some of the most challenging things that people face from both sides, right? I coach academic members of staff who are having issues with the people they're mentoring and vice versa. And I think anything that helps give people tangible things that they can think about, tangible steps that they can take to improve some of these relationships, I just think is hugely important, because it's these relationships that they're fundamental to everything we do, right?
Absolutely critical. And there's research that links, success in academic programs and success in careers to the quality of mentorship one receives.
Yeah, for sure. And whenever I talk to people about their books and things, I also love to get to know a little bit more about the person behind the book, right? So what's been your most meaningful experience of mentorship? Either you mentoring somebody or somebody mentoring you.
Yeah, that's a really wonderful question. I mean, I've had so many people throughout my career who were so inspirational to me. And I think this is actually one thing that is maybe a takeaway. It is in the book as well, is that when I think about people who were important mentors to me, many of them were not mentors in the most formal way, where, we would have a conversation, we would say to ourselves, okay, we're mentoring now and we're in a mentoring relationship. But I can think of so many people who were teachers or my choir director in college or maybe professors I just had for a single semester. And looking back, I think when I think about people who shaped me the most, it was often those folks who were not formally mentoring me. I can think of peers who were really inspirational to me, but the formal relationships are also really valuable. And I think particularly getting mentorship from somebody who is in a formal relationship to you as a PhD advisor or as a boss or supervisor, I think because it might be even more difficult to mentor well and effectively in those power relationships. I think when you do find that kind of mentoring in that sort of relationship and you feel like your professional growth is being supported, it feels particularly special and rare. And I think too, and I think most recently, what's inspired the book directly is, now, and I guess it's helpful maybe to explain for listeners, is my current role at Duke University. I mean, I am a certified professional coach, and that's a hat I wear on top of my role as an academic administrator at Duke, developing programs for faculty. Much of what I do is coach faculty. So when I'm coaching people, I am their thought partner and I'm helping them to think through problems in a sort of semi-structured way and help them to think creatively and differently about things so they can solve problems, meet goals. Before I did that, I came to Duke in 2017. And for the first 3 years, my role, I hadn't trained as a coach yet. And I was asked to serve as sort of a free-floating academic advisor for doctoral students in the humanities and social sciences. And this was intended to be an innovation. At least in American universities, there isn't usually somebody outside the PhD program who serves as any kind of advisor. So, but there I was, and I was working with roughly 400 humanities doctoral students, and it was just drop-in advising, and they could come and talk to me about anything related to their academic professional trajectory. So often it was about things that they didn't want to talk about with their advisors. And here's the funny thing, when you asked me what was most impactful for the book in terms of a mentoring relationship, I was actually unable to think of myself as the mentor for these students. Yet they were coming to me and I was supporting them and giving them, designing workshops for them. But I think ultimately that was actually really beneficial because I didn't think of myself as their mentor. I was freed up not to act like a stereotypical mentor. I didn't feel like I had to know all the answers. I didn't feel like I had to advise them. I was doing a lot of listening, asking a lot of open-ended questions. And it was those realizations that made me seek out a certification in coaching because I realized that that's what I was doing with them. I was coaching them. I wasn't advising them. And looking back, it's always thinking about, who are you mentoring, even informally? So I think, again, it's really those were the relationships that inspired me to write the book. Actually, after I got certified to coach, the university asked me to design a 2-week course for doctoral students. And the course was called Best Practices in Mentoring. And as I discuss in the book, that that was sort of the birth of the book. I would teach this course to graduate students in the summer and they'd find it very engaging. And suddenly people started asking me to give talks. And then I started writing about it. And then suddenly the Chronicle of Higher Ed said, can you write about this? And one thing led to another, and then the book contract. So, and I think that's maybe an important thing for graduate students to understand. The way the book is titled, it sounds like How to Mentor Anyone in Academia. It's for people in these formal mentor roles. But that's actually only partly true. I mean, first of all, we can all be mentors to everybody all the time. I mean, so I want people to feel empowered to think of themselves as a mentor and be a mentor, even if they're not in that formal role. Many graduate students, especially as they advance in their programs, start becoming more of formal mentors to other students, right? I've worked with graduate students, for example, who they end up informally supervising undergraduates in these labs in STEM. And so many times, we're both mentor and mentee at the same time. So when I wrote the book, I was mindful of that. And so I think mentees or anyone who identifies in the mentee role, like a graduate student, would gain a lot from the book. I think it would help them to think about maybe things from their mentor's perspective, because I speak to a lot of pains that academic mentors experience. And I think there's a lot to be gained from bringing empathy to any relationship, especially difficult ones, and trying to see things from the other person's point of view. At the same time, at the end of every chapter, and there are 9 chapters in the book, I have a little section at the end called Takeaways from Mentees. So, for example, I have a section on how mentors can navigate power dynamics and relationships. Mentees can feel very powerless in formal mentoring relationships. But at the end, I suggest to mentees, okay, well, here are some things that you can do if you feel like, power dynamics are getting in the way of you having a productive relationship with your mentors. And I think honestly, I mean, what a lot of mentees want better and more generative mentoring relationships. There's only so much we can do if we sit around and wait for other people to change. There are techniques we can employ to try to, manage up or mentor up, so to speak. They may or may not be effective, but I think for people to feel fully like they're in control of their own professional trajectory and their mentoring relationships, they need to take stock of what am I not yet doing that I could be doing to improve the tenor of this relationship, or what am I not doing that I could be doing to get more of my professional needs met. I think that's a really important part of the equation. There's been a lot of talk in the academy about, okay, we need to train faculty mentors, we need to help them up their game. I mean, this isn't just me talking. I mean, these conversations are going on at educations all over the country, all over the world, maybe. But change happens notoriously slowly in higher education. I talk about that a little bit in the last chapter. So I think for a mentee who only has maybe 2 or 3 years to work with a mentor, they're going to need to do some things now. And it's much easier to change our own behaviors and mindsets than it is that of another person we're working with.
100%. And I think that notion that we're all mentors and mentees at pretty much every stage of our life is a really important one, right? Because I think often, like you say, more senior students underestimate the extent to which they're role models to the people that are junior to them. But I think we also underestimate how much their academic advisors or supervisors are likely to also be mentees to more senior academics who are supporting them to develop their career and things. And so I think having this sort of almost dual role that at most stages in our life we are both of these things, or we have the potential to be both of these things, I think is a really useful way of thinking about it.
Absolutely. And, I think our tendency to think that we can't mentor somebody or won't mentor somebody, I have a term for it. I think I coined it in the book, and I call it mentor imposter syndrome. And it is basically the false belief that we cannot help somebody else. We can't be helpful. And like one example is I see it so much happening among disciplinary lines, because one of the things, that's I find a little odd is that different disciplines have been, I think people have been trying to solve, if you will, the problem of academic mentoring through disciplinary ways, right? So the folks in the humanities will be like, okay, here's our white paper on mentoring in the humanities, and the folks in the sciences, here's our white paper on how to be a good mentor in the sciences, so on and so forth. And if you look at like all these studies and white papers that are out there, they're saying a lot of the same things. They're just saying it to different audiences. So if we think about that if we accept or play with this idea that good mentoring actually is, the ingredients for that recipe are actually pretty similar from one discipline to another, then maybe it stands to reason that somebody, let's say in mathematics, could actually help somebody in English literature in some really profound ways, even if they're simply listening, asking questions, helping support them in problem solving, connecting them to other people who could serve as resources. That those are all really important components of mentoring, and they have nothing to do with disciplinary background.
100%. I think that comes back to your point of really figuring out what we mean by mentoring in the first, and really expanding that definition of mentoring anyway, because the disciplinary boundaries kind of make sense in the model where you're going to come and be me. If you're trying to figure out how to be a sports science professor, great, find a sports science professor, they'll mentor you through. But if mentoring as it is far broader than that, then it starts to be a bit more plausible that lots of different people from different types of backgrounds, different expertises can help you overcome those different challenges.
Right. And I do get pushback sometimes from folks who will say, well, what about, if I'm training somebody in the lab and they have to learn how to do the experiments? Like, of course, right? I mean, there's always going to be times and places for mentors to be more prescriptive and to give advice. Another example of this is if let's say in an organization and a new hire comes in and this person needs to learn the unwritten rules of the organization, they're never going to fit. I mean, they might, but they can try to figure them out themselves, but they're going to flounder for maybe 6 months to a year and maybe make some dumb mistakes. And so, yeah, there are times and situations when there needs to be a mentor who is an expert in something to show that person the way. But I argue in the book, most a lot of mentors do it way more than they need to be, speaking from that expert role.
And that expertise can be a variety of things, right? One of my most useful, very short-term mentoring experiences, but that led to pretty much everything I'm doing now, came from somebody completely different discipline to me, very senior member of staff at my old university, who essentially I was going to be asking for funding to establish a coaching program within the university. So whilst I still worked there, and I'd got the opportunity to go and like propose this to the toppest of the top at our university. And the person that was mentoring me essentially on how to manage that person, how to make this something, not how to present what I was wanted to do well, but how to present it in a way that this person was likely to see it as useful and it appeal to them. And it was one of the most useful mentoring conversations that I've ever had. And it led directly to them choosing to fund that, which then in turn led directly to me leaving the university to set it up separately, which is maybe not what their original intention was. But that was so useful. And that person didn't have expertise in coaching, didn't have expertise in my discipline or any of those things, but they had expertise in working with that one specific person. And they were able to help work with me so that I could make it something that was likely to land, and it did. So I think, yeah, the
Great
what people
example.
have
Yeah.
expertise in is can be very, very wide.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think some of us, again, we tend to underestimate how much we do know and how much of it might be valuable to other people.
100%. Now, I did want to ask you, so there was the very sort of first part of the book, you talk about mentoring with backbone and mentoring with heart. And I thought this was a really, really interesting concept. And I'm going to ask you about it in the context of mentoring first. And then I'm going to afterwards tell you why it struck me so much. But just give people a little bit of an outline about what you mean by mentoring with backbone and heart.
Yeah, so one thing I'll mention is I really wanted the book to be simple. And that's sometimes a hard thing to convince academics that there's value in things that are simple. Academics crave complexity for a lot of reasons. But I mean, mentoring is a really big, messy concept, and there is no universal consensus on what mentoring means or what it should be. And this is true. I mean, if you were actually to look at the literature on mentoring, you would actually identify hundreds, if not maybe 1,000 or more definitions of what mentoring is. So I think sometimes the more complicated something is, the more simple we need to go. It certainly works in coaching, and I think it applies to other areas. And so I was thinking about what is a very simple schematic I can use to help people think about coaching. And I found the concept of backbone versus heart is not unique to me. And I give credit in the book to Mary Beth O'Neill, who has a book called Coaching with Backbone and Heart. And it's written for coaches so that when you're coaching somebody, you have to have a certain rigor to what you do, but you also have to be empathetic. And when I read that title, I realized, whoa, this sums up many of my conversations with faculty mentors. And by that point, I'd had a number of conversations with faculty who felt like their mentoring wasn't going well for various reasons, and the reasons were different. But I realized that those mentors seemed to be falling on some kind of imaginary spectrum in my head. So there were two kinds, I think. So that so many mentors were floundering or having trouble in their mentoring relationships because they had never taken the time to build a solid foundation for that relationship, right? When they started working with a new mentee, there was no conversation where they sat down and said, okay, how are we going to work together? What are our expectations? What are the learning goals? How will we know we've been successful together? There was none of that. And then often at various points in the mentoring relationship, there were no clear norms for giving feedback. So mentors didn't know when they could give people feedback on their work, what they could say, what the mentee would find inappropriate or off-putting or offensive. And so all of that to me, or at least in the way I'm developing this, suggests a certain lack of backbone. Um, at the other end were maybe mentors who were very big on process and feedback, but they were maybe going about it in a way that wasn't terribly thoughtful. that they weren't maybe taking into account how the mentee might be feeling. They might have been sort of these mentors who are, nose to the grindstone. It's all business all the time. And that approach fell apart if the mentee was having a bad day, or if there was a death in the family, or maybe the mentor was just so pulled in a million directions, they just were not being fully present to the mentee. You can't build a relationship with somebody if you're never present to them. And so to me, that suggests a lack of heart. And so when I talk to mentors about mentoring, I usually will introduce that schema or that spectrum. And often, again, everything is, people respond differently to different things, but that concept has proven pretty productive and generative in my coaching conversations. And that's why I use it there.
Yeah, definitely. And I think one of the things I like that you emphasized is that those things aren't mutually exclusive, right? I think sometimes people do see them as two ends of a spectrum, and you have to either be more at one end or more at the other end.
Mhm.
But I thought it was interesting some of the models that you use where people could be high in both, where people could, I think you talked about high challenge and high support, for example,
Oh,
like
right,
that,
right. That's the challenge support matrix.
where
Yeah,
people,
yeah.
where you can have a good amount of backbone, a good amount of structure and things, and a good amount of empathy and appropriate levels of kind of contact and caring.
Yeah, absolutely. For listeners, we're referring to it's like a grid, right?
Mhm.
So another way of thinking about mentoring or how we calibrate, especially with supporting mentees who are maybe easily discouraged or maybe they're first gen students and they feel like, oh my gosh, I can't hack it in this environment. The mentor needs to be especially thoughtful about the level to which they challenge the student. And this is not about, watering down one's expectations. This is about continuing to hold the mentee to high expectations while also matching it with an appropriate amount of support. And that is a very delicate balancing act. And no grids or schemas are going to make it an easy task. It's challenging. But I think that's really the thing, is that there's no one right setting, right, on the mentoring hearts, like, dial that works for every mentee in every situation. And when I present the book, I've gotten some great feedback on the idea of how do you balance challenge with support or backbone with heart. And I've, had some experienced mentors point out, well, in the very beginning of a relationship, it might be we need a little bit more backbone. And then maybe later on, there may be reasons to lean more into the heart quality. So it depends, right?
And sort of choosing that balance for the particular situation and adjusting it as necessary.
Yeah. Yeah.
Quick interjection. If you're finding this episode helpful, but you're driving, walking the dog, or doing dishes, just remember this. When you're done, head to thePhDlifecoach.com and sign up for my newsletter. We've all listened to a podcast and thought, this is great, I should do something with it, and they didn't. That's why I created the newsletter, to help you actually apply the stuff that you hear. Each week, you'll get a short summary, some reflective questions, and one simple action that you can take right away. You'll also get access to a searchable archive of all the past episodes, so you can find the exact one that you need to help with your current challenges. Plus, all newsletter subscribers get a free webinar every single month on a topic that affects all PhD students and academics. And you will always be the first to hear for when my membership opens to new members. So once you're done listening, or even right now, go sign up for my newsletter and make sure you don't miss out. Now, I alluded when I asked the question that I had other motivations that stuck out to me. And the reason for that is one of the things that we talk about a lot on this podcast, but also in my membership, is this notion of sort of self-management, is being a better boss to yourself. And one of the things I've noticed within individuals is that they either think they need to have a lot of backbone with themselves and be really strict and like hold themselves to very, very high standards. Or at the other extreme, they'll be very indulgent. Oh, it's okay. I can do it tomorrow. I'm quite tired today. I don't need to do it. Da, da, da. And we spend quite a lot of time trying to find a boss, as we call it, that sits in an appropriate place in between those two things, that enables them to support themselves to do challenging things in a way that feels kind of supported and looked after. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you see that kind of backbone and heart metaphor applying to how we mentor ourselves as well.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that's also a very strong, I hope people will see it that way, a strong message throughout the book, especially for mentees, is, I think at one point in the book, I offer what I call the $10 million question to mentees, which is something like, what does it look like for you to to take
Take
control.
ownership of your academic.
I'm gonna take ownership. That's it. Thank you. Okay, we have it
$1 million
written down.
question
All
so
right.
much that I've got it written down in
Yeah.
the middle
So
of this
yeah,
piece
what would
of
it look
paper.
like for you to take ownership of your progress, or your professional trajectory in the context of this relationship? So yeah, so taking ownership. And it is hard because when we think about taking ownership, then we do have to think about the level of rigor we hold ourselves to and the level of maybe understanding or grace we give ourselves. I will say in my experience of working with academics, both faculty and students, I personally find that people tend to be too hard on themselves than too easy. I have often said that, in fact, when I'm coaching faculty or grad students, they often need more help not working than working because everything in their experience has drilled into them that they need to work, 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 work. So that's one thing. And how do we pull people back from the overworking ledge, right? It's a great question. And I think my solution or my approach in coaching tends not to be like, oh, go have a bath, take a rest, get a massage, or something. And nothing's wrong with those things. But I try to encourage people to tap into what what gives them energy, what makes them happy, what makes them joyful. And much of the time, when they're able to do that, they actually work better and they work more effectively, and but they're working in fewer hours. And hopefully they will also take the time to think about, well, what gives me energy outside of work? What makes me joyful? How can I make time for those things? And I think the concept of flow is really important. When we're in a state of flow, it's like time stops. We just forget what we're doing. And so sometimes it's a question of like, what is the kind of work that is going to get you more into a flow state? And I think another strategy, and this is something in the book, there's a book called The Inner Game of Tennis that a lot of coaches love. You may be familiar with this one, right?
I'm not, but
Um,
again, it's so funny that you're picking these bits out. Again, that is on the in game of tennis on my notes.
okay, so The Inner Game of Tennis, it's funny. Sometimes I think we should just all sit down and take a year and read all the old books that we haven't read yet before we read anything new. So there's a book by Timothy Gallwey, The Inner Game of Tennis. It was written in the 70s. And Gallwey was kind of an interesting guy because he was an expert in adult education, I think. And he also taught tennis at this like exclusive club in California. And he was able to write a book that drew on both those things. And he observed that when he was teaching anyone how to play tennis, the real game was not being played on the court, but it was being played inside the head of the player. And he said, all of us have two players inside of us, player one and player two. And player one is the critic. Player one is always judging what we do. It's always telling us that we suck at everything. He doesn't use that word. He's always telling us that, it's just not good enough. We need to do better. And when we listen to player one, guess what? Our performance suffers because we're so obsessed with being perfect and doing it well. And he said, but player two is the player who just naturally knows how to play and loves to play. And so he said, if you're teaching anybody anything, it's not just tennis, that, one of the best things you could do as a teacher is to help them access player two and to spend as much time being player two as opposed to player one. And so that's another concept I use with people I coach and mentor is, who are you when you're player one? How are you feeling and what are you doing as player one?
No, definitely. Because I think so many of these skills that we develop when we're thinking about how we relate to others, right? We're thinking about how can we be curious about what's going on without being judgmental, for example, right? One of the first things of mentorship is that you don't just rush in, tell them they're stupid and what they should do instead. Yet so often that's what we do to ourselves, right? It's like, oh, I procrastinate. I need to stop being lazy and I need to just get on with it. Just is banned. The word just is banned in my membership. Just get on with it. Yet when we're developing these mentoring skills, we're learning how to ask interesting questions about what might really be going on, how to think through all the different options there might be, how to validate those different options, etc., etc. And these are all the things we need to do with ourselves as well, right? And that's where I think this work is so interesting is as we said earlier, I truly believe that everybody is both mentor and mentee at most points in their life, if not all. And even if people listening are like, no, no, I'm really not a mentor to anybody, you absolutely can practice your mentoring skills on yourself. Because I think if you can get that bit right, A, life's going to feel so much better. But B, I think it makes you a more effective mentor. For me, the worst mentors are the ones that are highly critical of themselves, highly overworked, overstrung, all those things, and sort of kind of believe their mentees probably need to do that too. You know, if we can't manage this stuff for ourselves, it makes it really hard to then be a compassionate and empathetic mentor to others.
I think one of the coaching moments I felt most passionately about, I mean, when in the chapter where I discuss feedback, I ask, coaching moment, time out, I ask mentors to reflect on, well, how do you receive feedback? And so often a lot of the mentors are so uncomfortable with getting feedback on their own work. Of course, there's no way they're going to be comfortable giving mentees feedback because they maybe have maybe some issues. I mean, this isn't therapy, this is coaching, but maybe they've never really fully appreciated how difficult just the whole concept of feedback is for them. So how can they develop a comfortable culture for giving feedback when they have all these hangups about it?
Yeah. And also, I really enjoyed the chapter about, I can't remember quite what you called it, but about looking after yourself while being a mentor, that kind of self-supportive side of things. And I thought there were some really useful bits about how it's really hard to mentor effectively if you're burned out yourself, but to have this sort of time for reflection, it's really hard if you are essentially right at the end of all your own coping capacities as well, which I think sums up quite a lot of academia at the moment, which is
Yeah.
obviously a challenge to everybody involved.
Yeah, and I think it's really kind of a radical thing to think about, right? Because, there are a lot of now over the past few years, at least in the States, we have the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, and they've developed all these trainings and curriculum. I'm also certified to teach that curriculum. These are great trainings, but they emphasize competencies. It's like, okay, well, communication and giving feedback to your mentee. But what about the competency of wellness? I think there's competencies that mentors need to have that we don't always think about. And then if we really take the competence of wellness seriously, I mean, that affects so much of who we are. We bring our whole selves to mentoring. So if we're really going to up our games as mentors, it's not just about, taking a few trainings and honing a few competencies. It is a lifelong process, I think, of constant reflection on who am I, how am I showing up to other people, and how can I be most helpful to them?
Yeah.
These are not easy questions to think about.
No, for sure. And I was actually going to take you back to the question that you asked, because I'm aware partly I chatted over it because I was so excited that I had written it down too. But I also I want you to give some ideas for the listeners because I'm actually getting people who aren't signed up yet for my newsletter. I always have 3 take-home messages, 2 reflective questions, and an action from each podcast. And I, with your permission, I'm going to steal this question for one of the reflective questions because I think it's brilliant. So I'm going to say it again. I'm going to ask you for some tips that might help people. What would it look like for you to take ownership of your academic and professional growth in the context of this mentoring relationship? So what sorts of things do you think mentees can do to take ownership of that growth?
Such a wonderful question. I would say probably the beginning point is for the mentee to have a clear understanding of what they need and what they want, which it's just complicated in itself because there are plenty of situations where a mentee may not fully understand what they need, but we got to start somewhere. So, right. And so, if you need somebody to talk to you about, let's say, writing grants or getting funding, what is it you need? And so I think it's really identifying, first of all, what those needs are, and then thinking about what can I do? Who can help me meet those needs? And then how can I communicate to that person that I need help with this? So I guess it's really 3 parts, right? Identifying the need, identifying the likely person, and then actually the communication or making the ask, which I think for some people is the most terrifying thing. There is a tool in there that I did not invent. I have a link to it in the book. It's called a mentoring map. And there are examples that exist for both faculty and for graduate students. I mean, they're freely available online. And again, there's links in the book. But if you're a graduate student, you have a mentoring map. The mentoring map it's like, if you look at it, it's like a bunch of squares and they're all sort of linked to each other. And you, the mentee, is in the middle, is a bucket of need. And so it could be like, here's someone to help me with writing skills. Here's somebody to help me with maybe the soft skills. Here's somebody to, who's a confidant and can provide a safe space. And so it starts with asking the mentee to list all the needs. And then we start brainstorming about who are the people, both known to you and maybe less well known, who could maybe serve as mentors, either as formal mentors or informal mentors. And then we get into things about how do you make the ask. So there are different ways to approach this, right? If it's a formal mentor, we may need to think ahead of time about how can I frame this ask? What's maybe I should practice this with a friend, how to ask without sounding too needy or anything or resentful or anything like that. Um, so there's that. And then if it's an informal mentor, that's even more complicated sometimes because that might involve something like cold emailing somebody you've never met or finding a third party who can introduce you.
Definitely. And that made me think of your backbone and heart thing again, because I think when you're doing something that feels challenging, like contacting somebody you don't know, for example, I think having that kind of backbone and heart with yourself is so useful too, right? That on the backbone side, right, how can I make as best case as I can as to what this should look like and what I can learn about doing this well. So having that kind of structure so that you don't send an email that's accidentally rude or accidentally over the top or whatever. But then also the heart side of how can I be kind to myself so that if they don't reply or if they say no, I don't
Yeah.
end up telling myself loads of stories about how it's because I'm rubbish and I wasted their time, right?
Right, right. And I talk in the book about self-limiting thoughts. I think that's actually the most common self-limiting thought I hear when people are not willing to reach out. And I think, I think also students may be intrigued to know that I have worked with very senior people who are afraid to reach out. I mean, I think all of us on some level, we never get over being in middle school afraid of that rejection. But I think one way to think about it, like for example, this concern that, oh, they're going to ignore me and I'll feel awful. I mean, this is actually a way of bringing in some backbone to it because it involves some metrics. But if you imagine, let's say you say to yourself, okay, well, let's assume, I don't actually know what the rate is, but for every cold email I send out, every two I send out, one will get answered. If you can tell yourself that up front, then suddenly when only half your emails get answered, it's like, oh yeah, look, I was right, and that suddenly is not about you anymore.
Yeah,
But it's
100%.
also,
I have to
yeah,
remind myself this and reminding yourself that for every one who didn't reply because they think you should never have contacted them in the first place, there will be a whole load that don't reply because they are overwhelmed, because they keep intending to and not getting
yeah,
around to it, or because they now feel bad because it's been too long and they feel stupid replying this late.
that's right. There's all kinds of reasons,
And there's
right? We
so
don't.
many reasons. Okay, so I'm going to take you in a different direction now because towards the end of the book, as you know, you talk more about change and you particularly talk about kind of some of the structural stuff that underpins all of this and the things that institutions can do to support mentoring. So I have a question for you. If you were in charge of the universe and you could make one change at kind of senior university level. So a new rule, a new policy, a new procedure. You can't just suddenly make everybody motivated to mentor as their favorite thing. But if you were in charge, you could change one rule or process or policy. What do you think would have the most impact on improving mentoring?
That's, to me, that's easy. We need to change the rules around tenure and promotion. I think that so much of this is generated by, again, faculty, they don't have a lot of time. And inevitably they're going to put their focus and energy on the things that are going to give them job security and stability. And I think many mentors would love to spend more time and energy thinking about mentorship, working with their mentees. But the books must be written, the grants must be written, the presentations must be given, the classes must be taught, and that's important too. But I think what's happening right now, we have this funny thing where we're saying one thing but doing another in higher ed, which is we're telling mentors, oh, you must be better mentors. This is so important for student retention and success. And we're not giving them much incentive to take time away from that all important work of teaching. And in many institutions, it's just research, right? Research one, that's what it means. It's most of what you do is research. So what that means is, and I think for people who don't fully understand this, that at a research institution, you're not going to get tenure if you don't have a really impressive research program. You just aren't, even if you're the most amazing teacher in the world. Because when people talk about, you're right, the basis for tenure and promotion being sort of this, they call it, at least at our institution, they call it three legs of a stool.
Yeah.
But it's a very uneven stool because the research leg is the biggest, fattest leg. And then there's teaching, and then the thin stool is what they call service, which is another sloppy category. But mentoring is like, is this the fourth leg of the stool? I don't know, you know? So again, I think we need to do something about this misalignment structurally. Yeah.
100%. Because not only does that change what people are incentivized to do, but it does also change ultimately who gets promoted as well. Because one
That's
of the
right.
things that never fails to baffle me is that universities will design promotion structures that promote people who are particularly good at hitting those targets, right? And
Mhm.
so at the moment, especially in research intensives, like you say, they're going to promote people who are really good at getting grant funding and who are really good at chugging out papers or books, right? Depending on the discipline.
Mhm.
And that's great. But then if you start moaning that those people aren't loving, caring members of the community and aren't spending lots of time looking after their students and all those sorts of things, it's a little bit like, well, these are not the people a lot of the time. Some of them are, don't get me wrong, they just need more time and they just want to not have so much pressure on the other stuff so they can do that well. But others are just not good at that stuff. And we've just promoted the wrong people. Whereas there's a whole bunch of other people who maybe aren't quite getting as many grants, aren't quite publishing as many papers, often because they are spending their time in the mentoring stuff, even though it's not kind of valued and it's not promoted. If we promoted them to tenured professor, then they would be the people who are actually good at doing this stuff and actually could be doing it and leading other people doing it. Well, drives me mad. It's so frustrating.
It is. It is very frustrating.
I guess it's tough. This is now getting you into technical questions. This is my senior leader hat coming back on for change. Is how do you measure that stuff? You were going to have mentoring, effective mentoring as part of promotion criteria. How do you measure it?
It's such a wonderful question because, I think, we think about when, you asked me like, well, who are your most impactful mentors? I mean, I had to think about it. And I think in a lot of cases, it wasn't clear to me even like the effects of mentoring, right? Until years down the line, like, oh yeah, that talk I had with so and so, or I'm glad that person made me take this class. It would not be scientifically sound to link any student's successful career outcome to one factor, right? Including mentoring, because there's so many factors. So we really can't look at that. I mean, it helps, but it can't be the only thing. I think so often it comes down to a lot of subjective measures. I mean, including and especially the mentee's own sense of how helpful the mentor has been in the moment. What's different for the mentee because they've worked with the mentor. And I think because the measures tend to go back to the mentee and then we have to collect that information, it can be very difficult to collect that information, right? Because, especially if the mentor has power over the mentee is less likely to complain to higher ups, I didn't get what I needed. Yet, I think another way, which maybe takes us away from this more delicate situation of power dynamics between individuals, is to think about what does it mean to have a robust mentoring culture? And
Yeah.
what are the hallmarks of a healthy mentoring culture? And I think that's easier to measure, right? So, how many hours are mentors spending in working with
Mm.
mentees? What are the trainings and support programs available for mentors? What are the opportunities for informal mentorship for mentees? And so, I think if we're thinking structurally and having our leadership hats on, it may be more effective to work at the level of culture
Yeah.
than trying to tinker with the quality of individual mentoring relationships, which among other things can make faculty mentors incredibly defensive.
Well,
So,
and that's the challenge, right? I think in the book you
yeah.
describe it all as a wicked problem because it is one of these just so complex. Because I've seen like supervision awards and all this sort of stuff, which is lovely until the point that you find out that some academics tell their students to nominate them because I need it for my promotion or whatever,
Oh
and
yeah.
other supervisors just wait and see whether they're lucky enough or don't even have time to think about it or whatever. And then you have situations where the problems are actually on the student side rather than on the advisor side. And so then an otherwise amazing advisor is having complaints against them that are more sort of originating from the student. Yeah, it's incredibly difficult. And I think you're right, that sort of trying to create a culture where this is what we do, that looking after these people is what we do, and that that's supported and that there's time for it
Right. And another index I think would be just how often does the department convene even to have a conversation about mentorship, or is it even a bullet item on the agenda of the department meeting? I mean, that's something that surprised me initially, where I talk in the book about this, where I occasionally get, invited into a program or department to talk about mentoring. And it's like a huge event. It's like the Macy's Thanksgiving parade, except it only happens once every 5 years, right? So it's like, oh my gosh, we're going to talk about mentoring. But it's like, well, what's keeping you guys from talking about mentoring regularly, like you do with teaching or research or anything else you do as a faculty member?
Yeah, no, for sure. And as we mentioned, the book's got nine, I think, isn't it? Different sections where we
Yeah,
talk about different
yeah.
things. And one of those was, well, they were all fascinating, but one struck me was thinking about mentoring across careers that go beyond the kind of traditional academic career. So maybe you can tell me a little bit more about why you picked that as something distinct to talk about, why that felt so salient.
Yeah, well, I think more and more mentors are being called upon or expected to mentor mentees who aren't going to follow in their footsteps. And that's generating a lot of frustration on both sides, both for mentors and mentees. I first started working with graduate students at Duke before I started working with faculty. I initially heard about it mostly from the perspective of I I don't think I'm going to get a job in the academy, or I don't want a job in the academy.
Mm,
And I don't feel like I can tell my advisor about this because they're going to write me off or think I'm not serious, or at worst sabotage me. And so a real fear of being honest with mentors about one's career
mm,
objectives. And then in cases where, for mentors, some it's about like, well, how can you make your mentees feel safe even coming to you to talk about different career objectives? How do you feel about those careers, right? But then the ones I think who really got it, who understood that, okay, there's only going to be 4 jobs in our field this year, nationally. So what are we going to do? I think often that mentor imposter syndrome flares up most acutely
mm,
for mentors who feel like, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to help this person figure out what to do that's not being an English professor, and I don't know anything about these careers, and oh my gosh, so often the refrain, right, we weren't trained to do this. I hear this from the mentors. And I think, I'm hoping in the book to try to just reassure mentors, you might need to do more than you're currently doing, but it's not probably as much as you think you need to do, right? Which a lot of it is simply, what are the ways you can be helpful to somebody if they want to do something you don't understand at all? And well, there's actually a lot, right? And so again, it goes back to more of these coaching mode more than this advising or answer giving mode, which is listening, providing that support and understanding, asking thoughtful questions, helping to be a problem solver, helping to connect that student maybe to someone in their network who knows more than you do. You may not know much about museum management, but maybe your next door neighbor manages a museum, right? So there's things that you can do. And also, again, help encourage them to build a larger network so they have that infrastructure, or help them find career services on campus, right? So I think those are the kinds of things. I talk about mentoring, also the function of what I call being a connector becomes
yes.
really important for mentors, right, in these situations. So I think those are some of the issues that crop up on both sides when we talk about mentoring for careers that are not academic ones.
One thing that struck me when I was reading it that I'd love to hear your perspective on is I think there's also an extent to which the mentors need to manage their own emotions about the situation too, because often in my experience on all sides, I've been an advisor, I've been a mentor, I've been a student, obviously, and now coaching all these PhD students and academics. And one of the things I see a lot is that it's not just a lack of knowledge that the mentors are dealing with, it's that they're a bit disappointed that the person doesn't want to stay on in academia because they love sending their people off into the different research groups around the world or whatever, or they're somewhat embarrassed that, have I put them off academia, or they're judgy that they're actually like, ew, why would you want to do that? You're selling out and that sort of thing. And so I wonder whether you had any thoughts about, well, whether you see that sometimes it's their sort of emotional
Yeah,
reactions that drive
there's
behavior
so
and
much.
what we do about it.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Yes. There's so much emotional entanglement in mentoring relationships, partly because, there's such a tight association with, that somehow what your mentee does is a referendum on you and your career choices and your career trajectory. And I think it's really essential for mentors to develop the kind of self-awareness where if they're having feelings about what the mentee is deciding to do, they need to step back and think about where are these feelings coming from and what's this really about. And so all those things, right? Disappointment, maybe this person is convinced that their mentee, is the answer to all the problems in the discipline, and they're going to save the discipline because of their amazing dissertation, and suddenly this person's going to go into banking.
They're going to stay in the lab and help you, right? I've seen that as
right,
well.
right. And actually, I was, some of these coaching moments can be a little provocative, and one of, I don't know, nobody's written me hate mail yet, but one of the pricklier ones I felt was one where I actually implied or suggesting that maybe mentors might be dealing with some disappointment about their own careers. And the reason I feel bold enough to say this is, I was a tenured faculty member at a small college for 11 years. And towards the end, I felt trapped. And because, for me, I ultimately, I'm not making a statement about tenured careers, but for me, being tenured at this small institution just increasingly wasn't a good fit. And there were a couple of situations where I had not people I was mentoring, but colleagues who left. And I suddenly realized, oh my gosh, I feel kind of jealous. Oh my gosh, this person has freedom. I don't feel brave enough to do this. But there could even be situations where, and you think about like faculty, I actually use this metaphor in the book. I talk about academic careers being like roller coasters, not so much the ups and downs, which are real, but then once you're midway through the ride, already belted in, it's very difficult to get off, right? Especially after you're tenured, because, here you now, you've sunk what, a dozen years into this career, and frankly, you're not really trained to do anything else. It gets harder and harder to switch gears or even go to a different institution with tenure. It's going to create all kinds of issues around how you think about career stability and risk taking. And, I argue too, tenure tends to attract folks, including myself initially, who are risk averse, because tenure, what's safer than tenure? I ask this in a sardonic way right now.
No, for sure. For sure. And then to finish off, I'm going to get you to tell people where they can find you on all of those things. But let's finish with, what is the most surprising thing that you would recommend that mentors do? Something that people go, oh, I had never thought of that.
Well, I don't know if it's surprising. It shouldn't be surprising, but if I could only say two words to mentors, it's stop talking. Please stop talking. And I just, oh my God. We just talk too much. And honestly, it's not something I would even have thought to have said until I trained as a coach. And it was just completely eye-opening. And, I'm the kind of person who like people will say, like, if I'm in a group of people, I do tend to be kind of quiet and do more of a listening. I just naturally fall into that. But even I realized, oh my God, I spend way too much time talking, right? Especially in one-on-one, or if I'm trying to be helpful to somebody. But, if mentors did nothing else but just talk a little bit less after reading this book, I will consider it a huge win. And because everything else flows from active listening, even in professional coaching. A lot of coaches love their tools and techniques and frameworks, and there's a place for those. But I'd like to call active listening the Swiss Army knife of coaching, because you can help anybody solve just about any problem through listening with presence.
Amazing. So, thank you so much. I'm going to flash the book up for people watching on YouTube again, How to Mentor Anyone in Academia. Remind people where they can find out more about you and about the book.
Well, I guess I would direct them to the Princeton University Press website, Skills for Scholars series. So you just Google Princeton University Press and the title of the book. My little page will pop up. I'm also a member of something called Pup Speaks. So we're a speakers bureau. We're Princeton University Press authors who are available for, talks and workshops and things. So if anyone's interested in something like that, they can contact Princeton University Press through the Pup Author website.
Perfect. And I will link all of that in the show notes as well. So thank you, Maria, so much for coming on. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and I will see you next week. Thank you for listening to the PhD Life Coach podcast. If you like this episode, please tell your friends, your colleagues, and your universities. I'd appreciate it if you took the time to leave a review, give me stars, stickers, and all that general approval as well. If you'd like to find out more about working with me, either for yourself or for people at your university, please check out my website at thephdlifecoach.com. You can also sign up to hear more about my free group coaching sessions for PhD students and academics. See you next time.